I'm Ellen Rocco, the station manager, and I work with Claire and Amy on North Country at Work, which I assume all of you know about. Claire and Amy have talked to you some, I'm sure, about the project. And the cool thing is we're in this new phase of doing story slams like this. And what's been so exciting is, and I already see it before you started to tell stories, how in these small gatherings, albeit usually a little bit larger than this one, but in these small kind of neighborhood town gatherings, people all know each other. They know each other. If you make references to people or places, everybody knows exactly what you're talking about. And it's great for me because, and for all of us on the team, because we feel pretty close to the small towns across the region, and I love being in this setting because I don't have to explain to someone who doesn't live in this neck of the woods. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, Racket Lake is relatively close to Old Forge. Oh yeah, how far apart are they? Oh, 20, 25 miles, something like that. That's close, or more. I don't know. You guys know exactly, but that's close. We drove almost 3 hours to get here from my house. So that's 25 miles, that's nothing. I'm sure Mitch drives all over the place as a storyteller. You probably did too, Wayne, for many years. So we have it, but we're all part of this, what I call the Adirondack North Country is just one big small town. Because we all relate to each other. We all know the different, someone over in Tupper may not hang out here that much, or someone in Newcomb may think, oh yeah, they're way over in, the western side of the park or the southern part of the park. But we all know we're part of the same, not to sound too corny, the same fabric. But it is. It is really part of the same fabric. So we're very excited to collect some stories here tonight. And as Amy said, these will definitely be on our North Country at Work archive. And you'll hear many of the stories we record tonight, if not in their entirety, somewhat edited by Amy or Claire to make them really shine. They'll rub a nice shine on them for broadcast purposes. You will sound better than you've ever sounded before. Fear not. So without further ado, I would like to bow to both age and beauty to start us off tonight with Helen Bice. And she's going to talk about, I see you have that pay stub in your hand. We should get a scan of that pay stub. Helen, is that your first pay stub? Yeah. So just, do you want to stay there and just talk into the microphone and tell us a little bit about your work here in your working life here?
Okay. Well, one of my first jobs was working in the post office in Wells. It was a busy place during World War II, well, in the early 40s. And it was a big money order business because of the distance from the stores. People had no way to get to the store to do their shopping. So they did a lot of shopping by catalog, and they sent money orders. We had 2 mail deliveries a day, and you would order something. There was a big Montgomery Ward store in Colony Center, and Sears Roebuck had a big store in Chicago. And those 2 stores were the biggest ones. Probably the biggest ordering place was Montgomery Ward in Albany, Colony. And it took, people ordered by money order. And in 3 days, you would get your order. And my pay was 45 cents an hour.
Which I think is what they make at Amazon now.
Yeah. in those days, the postmaster, if we had a Republican president, we had a Republican postmaster. If we had a Democratic president, we had a Democratic postmaster. So the places of the post office changed. Usually, I can remember the post office, Albert Early was the postmaster, and I remember the postmaster's, his office was in his living room. I didn't work for him then, but I went there to get my mail. But anyway, World War II came along, and the General Electric Company in Schenectady it was a war plant, and they was advertising for help. So I went to the GE, and I got a job. I had brothers and sisters that lived in Amsterdam, so during the week, I could stay with them and go to Schenectady. Well, gasoline was rationed. You had to get signers. You had a slip that you came to I had to come up here to the Lake Pleasant, to the county clerk's office and get an okay to get gasoline. And you had to have signers that you were, yes, you had riders. And you filled your car. 3 in the front seat. There was no thing in the middle to stop 3 people riding in the front and 3 in the back. And you had, and I went to the GE and got a job, and you had to have your picture to get in. I can take it off.
No, leave it. I'll take a picture. Right like that. That's perfect. Keep talking.
Yeah. And
now I'll take a close-up. Perfect.
and you had to have signers to get your gas ration. And then, like I said, we rode 3 in the front and 3 in the back, and we took turns. Like I drove one week, and somebody else would drive another week, and so on, so that we all drove. And I got a job in the GE, in the screw machine department, in the office. And from there, I worked there for several years, and then I went to Building 52. That was 42. I went to Building 52 and worked in welded products. That was an interesting place. They did welding there, and they had big slabs of steel that they rolled, heated them, and they had to be a certain degree, and they were shipped to Russia. And we had a Rosie the Riveter on our floor. She paid no attention to anybody. She tended to her job, and that was it. I met a lot of interesting people in the GE, friends that I've kept over the years. I worked with a girl who, from Jamestown, New York, who went to school with
Lucille Ball.
oh, became, who did it?
Lucille Ball.
Lucille Ball, yeah. And that was interesting. I became good friends with her. She left the GE before I did and went to South Carolina and married a sailor. And I didn't hear from her after that too much, yeah. And after the war was over, oh, well, I want to tell you, my pay at the GE was $38 a week, and every month I bought a war bond. And we donated. I donated blood to the Red Cross. Let's see what else. Well, anyway, after I left the GE in 1946, my boyfriend, my fiance, he was in the Army, and he was stationed in North Africa. He was in Morocco, Casablanca, Sicily. And after the war, he came home. We got married. And but after the war, I came back to Wells, and I hadn't been home. Oh, I think I drew one unemployment check, and the postmaster, he was the one that I had worked for before. He was still postmaster. He came to me and he said, "Helen, my clerk has quit, and she's going to move to Schenectady. I need somebody." So I went back to work in the post office, and I stayed there for several years. And I haven't worked since then.
Now wait, did you have children?
Yeah, I have a daughter. Yes, I have a daughter. She is a school teacher. She teaches. She lives in in Yardley, Pennsylvania, which is north of Philadelphia.
So
and
after you left the post office, you became a mother eventually, and you kept the house, I bet.
Huh?
You kept home. You were a homemaker.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
consider that work.
Yeah. No, I didn't go back to work.
But keeping a home is
Yeah.
work.
Oh, well, yes, it is. And yes, I have a daughter. She is a school teacher. She teaches in a Hebrew school. And she was named Teacher of the Year and went to Israel. Every year, the 8th grade class goes to Israel. And she went as a chaperone. One of the chaperones. I have a picture of her wading in the Dead Sea. And she has 2 daughters. One lives on Long Island, the other one lives in Philadelphia. She is in hotel management and works for the Marriott. She is, and I have 2 great-grandchildren, a little boy and a little girl. The boy is 6, and the little girl she just turned 4.
Great. Well, thank you.
I wasn't sure just what you wanted.
We wanted exactly what you told us about your work life, and it's
Yeah.
really interesting to hear about going to work in industry during the war, as so
Yeah.
many women did. So that was, and then being associated with the post office. So that was
Yeah.
great. Thank you so much.
I'm going to call you Helen the Riveter.
Yeah.
That's your new name. Helen the Riveter.
Right.
No, he's going to be Helen the Riveter.
Yeah. So we in honor of Helen's age and seniority here, we allowed her to remain seated. The rest of you will not be allowed to remain seated. We expect you to come up here where I am to tell your story. And I think we'll go next to Wayne. Wayne Blanchard is going to come up and tell us a few of his stories of working through the Adirondack Park. Okay? For DEC. Come on, Wayne. You can put those right on a chair so if you want. So you can.
Well, I've had a varied career with DEC. I started in 1967 in the campgrounds, became the youngest caretaker they had at Golden Beach in 1969. And yeah, and ran the campgrounds and then I went trail crews and things, hit on a civil service test and ended up on Long Island. And I set up a division of operations on Long Island and was responsible for the destruction of Edgewood, which was a 14-story psychiatric center, part of Pilgrim State. And after that, I was allowed to transfer back to the Adirondacks, thank God. My wife's from Queens and made me promise never to take her back down there. And so, yeah, so I ended up back in Indian Lake, or actually my office was in Northville. I was in charge of all operations from Fulton and Hamilton County. And then years later, they sent me to Indian Lake to set up an office there. And I ended up being acting regional operations supervisor out of Raybrook. And during that time, one of the things that I was in charge of was the big blowdown that came across in July of 1995. And I remember in my home, I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, sounded like a freight train was coming. And the sky turned like a mottled brownish yellow. It was really strange. And all of a sudden the winds came, the trees along my field was right down to the ground, and my kids' swimming pool all of a sudden blew over the top of the house. And I said, something's up. So next thing I know, I get a phone call from dispatch in Albany to head especially to 8th Lake, where we'd had a fatality. And I had to call out my hazardous tree cutting crew in order to get to 8th Lake and by inlet. There were trees down through Marion River, Racket Lake, great big pines, and my tree crew had to cut away for me to get there. And all of the storm damage in the Adirondacks, I ended up recording for the commissioner's office. And then I'll pass these around, so if there's any questions on any of the campgrounds, about the campgrounds. Then I ended up doing a slide presentation program after the blowdown cleanup. I was in charge of Region 5's cleanup. I did a presentation at Star Lake, Tupper Lake, and in Albany with a slide program. So that basically was pictures of the cleanup and everything. And of course, at 8th Lake, we had a fatality. A Syracuse University professor and his wife and children were in a tent. The children were sleeping between the gentleman and his wife. Trees started in the back of the campground, like a domino effect. Boom, boom, into each other. Ended up, this maple tree came right across their tent and hit the gentleman in the chest. And not to be morbid, but his head exploded from the force. And his wife got internal damage, but the children lying between them wasn't touched. The caretaker took them to his cabin. They didn't even know what had happened. So that's all documented in there, some pictures of the tent and things. It was really gruesome. So anyway, some of the other things I was responsible for was not only cleanup, but I started writing unit management plans for them. And I wrote the unit management plan for Louis Lake and Indian Lake Islands, which was very controversial, and fought with the APA over those. Some of the items in there, such as Indian Lake Islands, being a wilderness area, they said we had to get rid of the picnic tables because they're not conforming in the wilderness area. Fine. I had an argument over that. So then I researched and found out that lean-tos are permissible in wilderness areas. So I said to the APA, fine, I'll take out picnic tables. I'll just replace them with lean-tos. And we're doing that now. The table can fold down inside a lean-to. So anyhow, after unit management plans and things, I retired. And they called me back from Albany to work seasonally and became the invasive species management specialist for the Adirondacks. And I started every campground. I walked every campground in the summertime, mapped them all, recorded all the invasives in every campground, and then tried to eradicate it all, kept track of everything. AmeriCorps kids helped me. And so I was the beginning of the whole invasive species program in the Adirondacks. Yes. Yeah.
When you say all the campgrounds, do you mean within a certain county or do
No.
you mean across the entire park?
Across the entire park.
Wow.
There are 50 of them. I even was over in Region 6. I did Cranberry Lake, Alger Island, all of those.
And I have another question. When you say invasive species, were you primarily interested in land
Yes,
species?
terrestrial.
Terrestrial.
Terrestrial,
versus
yes,
water.
yes, yeah. One of the first ones was a garlic mustard.
Yeah.
That was really bad at Golden Beach, 8th Lake through there. And of course, I worked closely with the Nature Conservancy. And we were provided some AmeriCorps children from Whitney area that I helped set up, the Whitney thing. And so we tried to eradicate as much as we could. In here, if anybody would want to look at that, I kept track every year how much we removed. And all the maps you can see is color-coded as to what invasive is there.
What, can you just tell us some of the other invasives? The mustard I know about.
Yeah, the garlic mustard is
Garlic
Japanese knotweed. And one of the things that I hate is what they call poison parsnip. It's a relative of the giant hogweed. And I started worrying about it because I started seeing some on the sides of the road. And of course, you get that sap on you, and it's photoactive. So you hit in the sunlight and starts burning you. I had one AmeriCorps girl, even though we had gloves on, goggles, everything, she was packing some of the cut pieces into bags. And one piece just raked across her, above her glove. The next day she came to me, and it looked like she stuck her hand right onto a hot stove. It burned her so bad. And so one of the things that's getting, how it's spreading, is DOT and their flail mowers on the side of the road. And I warned them about that. And even the county, the flail mowers, you mow the poison parsnip, the seeds, parts of it is getting onto your mowers. And unless you hose those off, you go from Utica area, all of a sudden up in Saranac Lake, you're using that flail mower. Well, next thing you know, you've got the invasive there.
It used to be, on our back roads even, up where I am, roadside invasive, or just roadside mowing was done with a sickle bar.
Yeah.
And they did switch to these large.
To the flail mowers, and they really get things stuck to them. Even the sickle bar mowers do. And
You do see DOT spreading all these.
oh yeah, yep. And then I was profiled in Nature Conservancy's publication, called me an invasive hero. I don't know why, what was so heroic about it, but anyhow, so finally I'm totally retired. And next thing I know, I'm town historian in Indian Lake. So I'd like to invite anybody to come to the museum Saturday and Sunday afternoons. And there's a pamphlet. I got some more if anybody's interested in it. And if you know, have ever heard of French Louis, I have French Louis sled. And that was made by my great-grandfather, Joe King. And I have a French Louis carbine that he used. I have pictures of an invasive, or not invasive, barrage balloon that came across Indian Lake 1943. I got that story. I got the whole story of Sabille, first settler of Indian Lake. Got a lot of World War II things. Got observation logs from observations for World War II. There was an observation post in Indian Lake that was manned 24 hours a day for aircraft. And I got those logs. I got a tremendous amount of pictures. Eliza can attest to that. So I guess it's my time.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. And we will be coming to the museum, definitely. Definitely. We want to see your photographs, too. So, this is kind of nice. We don't have to worry about, like, it's just us. It's kind of cool. Okay, next up, Eliza and her hitchhiker. Eliza Darling. And you are town historian for county historian,
And the town of Hope.
and the town of Hope.
And I work for John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
And you work for John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
And I have a private history.
And you, and you have a private history consulting business. And you're about to be a mommy. So, you know, you, 5 jobs.
Sorry, I was going to say, you're going to tell us about when you were a barmaid, but I don't think that's actually what you're telling us.
No. No, I think we'll leave that story for another time. Yeah. Well, I'm actually cheating a little bit because technically I'm from the town of Bleecker, which is in northern Fulton County, just over the Hamilton County line. But it's all right because my first job was actually in Hamilton County in the town of Benson, where I live now, at a place called Lapland Lake Ski Center. And I was about, oh gosh, I must have been 15 years old, and like most rural kids wanted nothing more than to get out and go as far away as possible and never come back. But in order to do that, I needed to earn a little bit of money first. And I was college bound at the time, and Lapland, which is a cross-country ski center, it actually started out in the 1930s, I believe, as a place called the Trails End, and it catered mainly to hunters and sportsmen from New York City, especially Staten Island. There were big connections back then, but it kind of morphed into the Lapland Lake Ski Center, I think in the 1960s, when it was taken over by an Olympic skier from Finland and his wife. And I think NCPR has already done a little bit on that place. But I got a job as a nanny, working for the couple, another Finnish-American couple, that ran the restaurant. The restaurant used to be open to the public at the time, and it was a very high-end kind of thing. They would fly in salmon from Finland at $100 a pop and just make them into these beautiful meals. But this wonderful Finnish-American couple had a little boy who was 18 months old. And I took care of him in a cabin all day long, just about every day for an entire summer. So they call the cabins tupas. They lots of Finnish names floating around, and so that was my first job, which was actually probably a bit surprising because Bleecker is right on the cusp of the Blue Line. It's entirely inside the Adirondack Park, and just down the mountain from there, you'll find the glove cities, Gloversville and Johnstown. Now, I had to go to school in Gloversville and Johnstown because our Bleecker schools closed back in the 50s. My mom went to one of the last one-room schoolhouses up there. And after that, we all got trucked, sort of all over the place. And most of us for work by that point, really by the 1970s, we were going down the mountain into the glove cities. There was nothing left in Bleecker or Benson. These are your quintessential logging towns. They had early on been farm towns. Logging came through, sort of like an absolute freight train. I mean, it was wood from the Adirondacks that built much of the urban Northeast, of course, during the 19th century. But, really by the 1940s, 1950s, that kind of work was really drying up. Bleecker and Benson and Hope and most of Hamilton County, tons and tons of sawmills, but most of them were gone by mid-20th century. And a lot of people in my neck of the woods, which is really not possible if you're from a place like where Wayne is from, Indian Lake, where you're deeper into the heart of the park. It's a longer commute to get over the Blue Line. And certainly not if you're from a place like Racket, which is 90 miles in either direction from anything even approaching urban. You got Utica on one end and Glens Falls on the other. But when you live in an edge town like Benson or Hope or Bleecker, usually you're going to be commuting to find work, and that was the case, even for kids. The minute you could drive, that was it, because that's where the money was. There wasn't much of it by the 1970s, I have to say, because of course Gloversville was built on glove manufacturing. It was producing something like 90% of commercial gloves in the United States, really right up to mid-century, and then it sort of took a precipitous dive. My father, who's from the town of Edinburgh, which is in the Adirondacks, but that's Saratoga County, was a tanner. He worked in the leather mills as well. And everyone in my family at one time or another had to leave, go down the mountain to find work. But that, of course, eventually dried up as well. So I left for college when I was, I think, 17 or 18 years old, and I was away for 22 years, I think. doing my undergraduate degree and then getting my PhD, I moved to Britain. I taught at the University of London, amongst many other places, City University of New York, Columbia. It's the new migrant labor, being an academic. I became a sociocultural anthropologist. That's what I do professionally. And when I came back, not a lot of call for anthropologists in the Adirondack Park. I got to tell you, it's not one of those professions where, we are desperately needed. You never really hear anybody stand up on a plane and say, "Quick, we have to interpret this ritual. Get me an anthropologist." Doesn't really work that way. But I was fortunate enough to find work in public history. Not a great deal of money or anything else, including prestige or honor in that either, but I love the work. And I wound up volunteering in the sector first while I was taking care of my mom, who was dying of cancer at the time, part of the reason why we came back. And then I got a job working for Hamilton County. So I kind of came full circle and wound up back where I started. And it's wonderful work, but as I said, not the most lucrative career in the Adirondacks, if there is any such thing as a lucrative career in the Adirondacks at all. This is a hard place to make a living and an easy place to lose a fortune. But I don't have a fortune to lose, so I'm actually okay. I get along just fine up here. Thank you. I'm really glad to be back. I do love working in the public history community up here. It's absolutely fantastic, particularly here in Hamilton County because our history is so hidden. With 3 people per square mile, we are one of the least populated areas, east of the Mississippi River. And it takes some digging to figure out our history, and events like this are, of course, very helpful. But it's absolutely fascinating work in terms of the reward, intellectually and psychologically and emotionally. I couldn't ask for a better job. I love this job, and it's fabulous.
Before you end, talk a little bit about your gig economy life, how you piece together your work life here in this very difficult to make a living environment.
Yeah, to be honest, being an academic for so many years, either, first as a student and then as a professor, and it was really the same when I lived and worked in Britain, where I went because my husband is British. That's how I wound up over on the other side of the water. It wasn't terribly different. Even in London, in New York, in Washington, all the big cities I've lived in. I was an adjunct, I was a temporary lecturer. If you know anything about academia, you'll know that particularly here in the United States, it is a gig economy. Universities are saving vast bucks by hiring contract labor. There's something like only maybe 25% of faculty in the United States, I think, are on what we call the tenure track, which means you have job security, you have benefits, you have maternity leave, which I don't have now, of course, unless I sort of wiggle it in myself, which I'm going to try to do. So really, it wasn't that different, and I knew it was going to be a bit of a stretch coming back here. And trying to make some sort of a living in the Adirondacks. I don't think I really realized till I got back how difficult it was going to be. But work has been like this in the North Country for a very long time. We like to talk about the transition from Fordism to flexible accumulation happening in the 1970s, deindustrialization, and the big factories shut down. They went overseas, and work changed. But up here, it's been like that for a very long time. We've never really had full-blown Fordism in Hamilton County where you're working for one company most of your life before you retire, unless you worked for the state. That is one of the few places, and by the state, I mean the government at any scale. So teachers, the post office is a potential career for some people, working on a road crew, that kind of thing. But in the private sector, we've never had that kind of stability or solidity. Even if in the heyday of logging, many sawmills only worked part of the year. Most of the tanneries did not run all of the year. If you were, by contrast, working in the more feminine industries like glove sewing, well, that had its own tides as well. So the precarity that I'm experiencing now is actually a long-standing condition in the Adirondack Park, and I think it's mostly government workers who've been able to avoid that in the past, and And I think that's true in the present as well.
I think we did a story on the percentage of work inside the blue line that is completely or largely paid for by government dollars. And it's something like 70% of the jobs in the park
Yeah.
have a connection to government money.
Yeah, I would not be surprised.
But it's very competitive in the state government.
Sure.
Extremely competitive.
Yeah.
Anywhere to get promoted.
Well, there's a whole sort of civil service, what we'd call in Britain a civil service kind of culture to it as well.
Luckily, Senator Farley's a friend of my family.
So tell us what the pieces are of your current working life.
So I have 4 jobs, not including being pregnant, which is a 5th, really. I work for Hamilton County as the public historian here. I recently took on that same role for the town of Hope, which has a bicentennial this year. They're celebrating 200 years, which is how I got landed with that job. I work for John Jay College of Criminal Justice teaching internet courses. That's in Manhattan. I do not travel to Manhattan, though my husband did when we first moved back here. He's an engineer. He had a job down in the city. He would travel back and forth every Friday, basically. So weekly in the city, weekends back here in the Adirondacks. I teach all internet courses. So a lot of people think this is the future of the Adirondack Park. I mean, every politician who comes up here from Albany tells us this is going to be the future. As soon as we get that high-speed internet up here, and I think we will, I know the county's working on it very hard. The problem is not everybody can be a CEO or a professor. And telecommuting only works for some jobs. The snow is not going to telecommute itself off of Route 30 in the winter, and rubbish does not telecommute itself from the transfer station out, and gin does not telecommute itself into people's glasses, et cetera. There has to be a blue-collar working class here for the park to continue to function. And I think as much promise as there is in jobs like mine, which is being a remote professor teaching kids down in Manhattan from Benson.
But there's no internet in Benson.
Roughly half the time there is internet in Benson, actually. So that's part of it. And I have a private history business that I call WADAC, where I have right now a sort of a long-term client doing the kind of things as an historian that I would not do as a public historian. So for example, right now I'm working for someone who owns a great camp and would like that intimately researched in great detail. So I would not do as a public historian research for someone else. So in my private history business, that's what I do. It's cobbling together a living as best you can with the skills that you've got. And as I said before, my skills are not particularly in high demand, which is why I've done other things up here, including bartending at the Racket Lake Hotel and Tap Room years ago. I was a PhD student doing my PhD research in the Fulton chain. Oh, I've got stories from Racket Lake, absolutely. I may have to seal those, and in 50 years, you can open the box and tell those stories on NCPR, because otherwise I don't think I'd be allowed back in Racket Lake at this point.
Oh, I told them a couple of stories. I didn't want them to record it, though.
Oh, we did.
About Racket Lake.
We did. We're sneaky that way. Thank you. That was great, Eliza.
Eliza, why don't you have the EPA put a question on their permitting process about the anthropological research on their projects?
There you go. Talk yourself into a job. Okay, moving right along. We have 2 more storytellers for tonight on our roster here. And next is David Pincombe. Come on up, David.
I am so glad that I was not to be the first one. I took a very liberal view of the title when Amy called me for North Country at Work. And I looked at it as how I was given a job when I was a very little boy. And I was taught the responsibility of learning oral history. And I say that I'm so thankful that I was not the first one, because I got to hear my relative, Helen Bice, talk, and I'm shaking my head. Oh, yeah, I remember hearing the stories about that kind of stuff that happened during the war. And I got to hear Eliza tell things about the glove industry and the leather industry, and that made me think of different things, because I was petrified that I could not think of anything how I was approaching this. I started out, my first 2 jobs were in the leather industry. Now the leather industry is simply gone. We thought nothing as a group of kids growing up in the 70s. I was born in 1959. My people helped to settle the town of Wells. The family moved in the late 1790s on my mom's side, in the Craig side. And it was nothing to have numerous jobs. They were doing it way back then. They were part-time farmers and part-time sheep herders, and my family ran 700 plus head of sheep at different times early on. And they were hop farmers on the same farm that they had the sheep. And in the early 1800s, the family, one of the brothers, he moved to what they called the lower farm it took on both sides of the Sacandaga River, and they did the agricultural work down there, and the mills, and the grist mill, and all these numerous things. And I stopped and I listened to what Eliza said about the glove industry and how Helen drove to Schenectady. No one thought anything of it. We just hopped in a car. When we were kids, we saw our parents jump in a car and pick up a whole bunch of other people and hightail it to Schenectady, or like my mom, she worked in a glove shop office in Gloversville. And, excuse me, I could hardly wait to be sick or something like that to have to go to a doctor's appointment, because I got to go to work with my mom. That was so much fun, because she had shown me how to work an adding machine and things like that. She would have me help her. She'd give me little tasks. And they didn't mind that I came to the office with her, because hand me a book when I was real little. Hand me a book. I was under the desk and I was quiet. Well, I stop and I think now how this thing has gone on all through all these generations. I have numerous part-time jobs also. I'm an office manager. I've worked my way up to being an office manager. I started out being an architectural designer for a man, lost the job when the economy slid completely downhill in 2009, and he brought me back part-time to be an architectural designer, and I worked for him for less than a day, and he looks at me and he says, "You can see we need an office manager. Do you think you could handle this? That's a challenge. You don't have to do it if you don't want to." Well, I took up the challenge. I found my niche. I love it. So he cut my hours, and I'm part-time with him. We had somebody that came into the building as our tenant. They needed an office manager part-time. I'm their office manager. I'm also a councilman in the town of Benson, where Eliza lives, my hometown now that I've lived there now for over 41 years. And so I commute to Gloversville, and I run the Benson roads all over the place and help to govern that. I'm a councilman, and I also hold the position of deputy supervisor there. And how this goes back to being how I looked at this initially with work. As a little boy, I had the same thing done to me that was done to my mom. When the family would get together for a wedding or a funeral or a whatever, all the kids would all be shooed outdoors. Beautiful weather. All you kids, out of here, out of here. They'd start shaking. The women would start flailing their hands, and everybody went out. And for my mom, it was, "Hermina, come back here." And a little cricket stool was gotten and put at the feet of the oldest person. And always, always, all these people all sat around each other in the big front room. And they started telling stories back and forth. She heard the histories. Now I came along. She was one of three. For some odd reason, her sister and brother did not pick up on, they heard the stories and they knew some of it, but she was the one chosen to tell the stories. I came along. I'm an only child. All the kids would be together in the big family get-togethers, and all you kids, will you get out of here? It's gorgeous outside. Go outdoors and play. David, come back here. And I remember the first time, and I was telling Amy that I can remember one of the ladies grabbed me, hooked her finger in my collar. David, come back here. And I immediately said, I didn't do anything. What did I do? What did I do wrong? No, come here. And I was sat on the same little cricket stool that my mom had sat on. And I heard the family stories. And the deal was you had to hear the stories, go around you, and then they asked you to tell them the story. And that's how it got handed down. And then you learned to go into history books and get more background and that type of thing. And that's the part of the work I don't get paid for, but that's the work that I enjoy the absolute most. I love that. Hearing about my family, hearing about distant ancestors and things that they did. My people were involved in the glove industry. My great-grandpa didn't think anything of it, left Pumpkin Hollow. He moved down and lived with his sister, and he worked in a glove shop. He laid off gloves. And I was able to see the end of this industry, and they were doing the same thing that Grandpa did. Grandpa and all the men, that was a prestigious position. They dressed up to go to work and lay off gloves. Jacket, suit, vest, tie, stick pin, watch chain, the works. And they went to work. My first job, we had a man, he did exactly the same thing. His little bird of a wife would walk on his arm down the hill from the shop, and she'd have her little purse on her arm, and he was all dressed up, and she was all dressed up, and he'd peck her on the cheek, and he'd go into the laying off room, and she'd go into the making room up the stairs, and she was all dressed up pretty, and he was all dressed up nice, and they did the laying off. He did the laying off work. And my folks thought nothing of being, Grandpa worked in the glove shop. He was a part-time Adirondack guide, bringing the sports around, and they love to have him guide them because he's this little tiny guy, and he maybe weighed 135 pounds soaking wet, and he was really good at what he did. And at one of the times, one of the sports gave him a beautiful stick pin, and I still have it. And I was shocked when I found out. I wanted it fixed, and I was shocked when I took it to the jeweler, and he says, "Do you know what you have?" And I said, "I've got my great-grandpa stick pin." And he says, "No, David, what you have is you've got a stick pin that has a rose-cut diamond into it. Quite a nice one." And I'm like, my mouth fell open. I was amazed. But I was entrusted with all of these family stories, and I am so grateful for that. And I do consider that, yes, it was work, job work, but work that I could never replace. I love it. It's really neat.
Can I ask, what does it mean to lay off?
What you do is you take a glove. They're already made. They've already been assembled. And my grandmother did home sewing of the gloves. Then the glove would go through a process. You roll it up in a very heavy piece of canvas. And the canvas is extremely fine woven. It's not like a canvas bag or a canvas jacket or something. Very, very fine. And you soak it in warm water. Then you take the gloves, and they're done in dozens, done in pairs, and you roll them up in this, and you soak them. You get them wet. And the laying off is very hot work because it's a steam generated piping runs up whatever part you need to lay off. It's either the hand or the thumb, and you put these gloves on this, and they're hot. The bronze is scorching hot. Heaven help you if you touch it. Your glove slides off and you touch your hand to it, you're burned. And you lay the glove off, and that stretches it and smooths it, and then it goes very nicely put together in a pair and stacked, dried, and then they go in to be polished. And that polishing job was my first job. Picking them up, putting them on the polish wheel after they were laid off and they're dry, and then you turn them inside to inside and outside to outside and polish them.
How old are you?
I was 18. My mom worked in the office and I worked out there.
Got a question.
Yes, sir.
Saying about the adults telling the kids to get outside all the time. Get out, get out. Do you ever have your mother or grandmother say, get outside and get the stink off from you?
No.
That's what my
No.
my grandmother, get outside and get the stink off.
Nope.
All those kids.
They got the biggest kick out of having, and that's something I was really honored by. I felt so trusted. The other kids, they were outdoors. Oh, they were having a blast. They were running and tearing and climbing trees and jumping off the roof and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Fine and dandy. I was learning something. I was learning history, stories. And I never, ever thought that I would tell it to anybody except I expected to have a family and never did. And it was just to be passed around into the family members. Doing this in front of anybody, I'm quite amazed and very honored.
Actually, it's really interesting to hear you talk about the process of sharing that oral history and being expected to repeat the stories back. That's, of course, a way of imprinting it forever in your mind.
They were not selective. Nowadays, you've got to be so politically correct.
Yeah, no.
And you can't say certain things in front of the children.
Right.
I always thought I was so honored because they treated me like an adult. They talked about some serious adult stuff. They talked about people that would say, well, now so-and-so, now David, don't you ever repeat this, but you remember this. So-and-so thinks that these are their people and they really aren't. They're these people. Or all kinds of stuff. And it was family matters. It was family history. But you learned all sorts of things. And that's one of the things that I was so honored by, but you had to learn an oral tradition. Also, because part of I have Indian heritage, local in the area. They couldn't say who they were. They had to keep their mouth shut. They passed as white. And I asked my great-grandma, I couldn't understand, why can you not say anything? She knew that I had gone through 3rd grade, and she always referred to me as boy. She said, boy, you've gone through 3rd grade, and you've taken the local history, right? I said, yes, ma'am. I'm thinking, oh, boy, she's going to tell me. She's going to tell me. She said, now tell me. If you knew that if you shot your mouth off and you told everybody what you were, what you could do, and all these different things people would learn about you, and then, because of it, and the rules that are out there, you and your wife were put on a reservation, your children were taken away from you and put in a home to make them anglicized white, and you lost the right to vote. You could no longer be a teacher. You could no longer be a minister. What would you do? Would you shoot your big mouth off and tell everybody what you could do? And I said, no. Now that was being entrusted with a family secret. But that was something I thought was just amazing.
Thanks, David. Well, as far as I know, we have one more storyteller with us tonight. Are you going to?
We've got a lot of time left.
No, if you.
I'd like to end with Mitch, but to steal a phrase of Mitch's that I heard a couple of weeks ago, I think what I've been thinking about for the last year when I first came to a story slam in Keene, that some of what I might have to say has become right. And I might be
Would you tell us your name? Yeah, well, that was kind of the thinking. What is your name?
Steve Stefano.
Steve Stefano. You're going to tell us a work story or something about your work?
That connects almost everybody.
Well, come on up and talk to us about work.
Is that okay, Mitch? That's great. If you're right, you're right. It's I'm not in Oregon, but I'm here in the Adirondacks. So I've been taking notes, and Alan, it's great to meet you in person and listen to you on the radio. And Wayne, I think we probably overlap with, I'm trying to think of the guy in Northville, the regional guy there, Tessier, it began with a T, 1972. Began with a T, lived in Johnstown. He hired the lifeguards, my first state job. Yeah, this guy, it began with a T, but anyway, I thought he was the regional guy, but anyway, it's long ago. I'm a little older than David. And where I work at the moment, I'm the oldest new guy in the building, but I'm not going to start my story there. I'm going to try to start my story with where I've been for the last 5 years, which is Wells Central School, as the business teacher. And for 5 years before that, I taught in a maximum security prison down in the Catskill region outside of Hudson. But when I first moved to Wells in 2002, one of the first people that I met was David's mom, Ermina, and she had a story for me to tell me how she knew my father in 1952 as the first policeman on the scene when David's uncle was killed by at the corner of 2nd Avenue and Kingsborough Avenue.
Where was that?
In Gloversville, which is just outside the park. But the first story that I hear from Ermina Pinkham, we were church mates, and she tells me this story of my father. I was born in 1954, and he was one of the first Italian policemen in the city of Gloversville, along with my uncle, which that kind of didn't happen, have an Italian police officer. A little further, okay. So Ermina tells this story about my father showing up on the scene of the motorcycle accident with your uncle. And then to hear Helen talk about the Sears catalog business, the house across the street from where I live in Wells is the Sears catalog house, which we ran into people a couple of years ago that showed up because they grew up in that, they spent their summers in that house, and they wanted to come back like 50 years later and see this house. Small world. And Eliza, a mentor, went to one of my students who wanted to be an anthropologist, who's now at SUNY Plattsburgh studying anthropology. Thank you, Eliza. It's just full circle with Hamilton County. And I think Eliza mentioned about working and patching it all together. And my career for 29 years was working in a restaurant and a bed and breakfast. And one of the things that we always said about being in the restaurant business, you're working toward becoming a millionaire. And I'm working on my second million because I lost my first million in the restaurant business. The glove industry, my grandmother worked for your mother's sister's last husband.
Oh, yes.
Miller's Leather in Gloversville.
Leather glove shop, yes.
Yep. Small world. It just kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I was born and brought up in Gloversville. And my first job was at 9 years old, raking leaves, shoveling snow, mowing the lawn in the neighborhood at 9 years old. and then going to work at Washburn's Dairy for $1.65 an hour. So that was like 4 times what your first job was. It 45 cents, did you say? 45 cents. So I was like, holy cow, it was 1966. A little more. And then became a lifeguard with the DEC in 1972. And I wish I probably did, but actually it was Bert Decker who was a night ranger, and Rich was the caretaker. I think his name was Rich. Caroga Lake. But I wish one of those guys had told me in 1972 to join the state retirement system, because that was tier 1, and I could have been retired in 2009 with 30 years at 55, but well, I'm hoping that all my students that I'm telling to sign the paper when they join summer rec to kiss me in 30 years when they're ready to retire, because nobody told me. So they won't remember my name, but that's okay. In Edgetown, Benson, Hope, Wells. My uncle worked at General Electric in the 70s from Gloversville, commuting. So here I am. In 2000, my life kind of went down the toilet in October, well, in 2001, when my grandmother died, who was my best friend. She died at 100. And then 9/11 happened. So things really went bad, and I wanted out of the city. So we found a place in Wells, ironically, in 2002, before everybody from New Jersey started escaping from the city. And at that time, I was teaching at working at the restaurant in Albany that we owned, also teaching at the prison in Hudson. Moved up, finally sold our restaurant, moved here in 2011. Continued to commute to Hudson, which was 110 miles one way. It was a long commute. And ended up running for the school board in Wells. And the first meeting that I go to, they're putting the business program back into operation after a 10-year hiatus. I'm certified in business. I'm a business teacher. Ran for the school board, got elected, walked out of the voting booth, and the district clerk came to me and said, the superintendent wants to talk to you. She has your letter of resignation drafted because we'd like to hire you as the business teacher. So I'm just entering my 5th year as the business teacher in Wells, and my goal, my whole MO, is to show the students, my students, that there are opportunities in the Adirondacks, because the biggest export that we have in the Adirondacks are our youth. We don't have them available for deputy town supervisor. We don't have them for caretakers in the campground. We won't have someone to replace. Eliza's the historian. I'm looking for a protege for Mitch. I'm looking for a replacement for me as the business teacher, because we just put the first Adirondack-centric career and technical education program in business in the whole Adirondack Park in Wells Central School, to show that our kids have opportunities in the Adirondacks. We're all getting on, and somebody's got to take over our businesses and take over the jobs that need to be done in the park that are blue collar. And our students are the ones that are going to do that. And if we don't keep the school going, we don't have a community. And a lot of schools in the Adirondacks are suffering enrollment-wise. So I'll end my story with the fact that I'm home, and I was conceived in a lean-to in Indian Lake.
Thank you so much. Mitch, Lee, you're the cleanup batter here.
You've all been very patient, and I have enjoyed everybody this evening. And I'm Mitch Lee. I'm from Inlet. That is kind of the western door to the county of Hamilton, and I've lived there all my life. I spent a couple of years outside the park getting an education, a couple of master's degrees, and floated back into the park and have resided here my whole life. Working in the park, currently I work for the town of Inlet. I do PR and tourism. I run their parks department. I also solely run a Presbyterian church as their bookkeeper, clerk of the works, and hiring, firing, cleanup boy, whatever, for that congregation. I also am the president of the local historical society, which I created 13 years ago. I'm also the treasurer of that organization. I also write a column, a weekly column, which I've been doing now for 16 years, called Growing Up Adirondack. And I'm also an Adirondack storyteller, which I've done professionally since 1989, and that affords me the ability to live here in the park. It's a very lucrative situation. There are not many storytellers that are professional storytellers in America, and I do a lot of traveling. But I love to work here in the park. I love to live here in the park. There are an awful lot of people who enjoy time here while we're all working in the park, and they often stop us in our tasks and say, "Oh, I'd love to live here. I just wish I could find something that I could do here, that I could make a living and afford the luxuries I have outside of the park." And I often have that brief conversation that sometimes it's not the luxuries outside the park you're looking for, but the luxuries inside the park at a lesser dollar that you actually need. And you need to talk yourself into that. But here's my story. So I'm a professional storyteller, and I travel from community to community, and oftentimes I book my gigs 3 to 5 to 7 months ahead of time. There's an email pops in, bing, and I look it all over, and it's usually a group of intrepid people who want a storyteller in for the evening. It could be as many as 60 to 6,000. Who knows where it's going to be, and it's always exciting for me to do the emailing back and forth, and eventually there's a phone call, and there's an actual voice on the other end, and you make arrangements, and sometimes you get a meal out of it. Sometimes a plane flight, sometimes a really gaudy hotel with like a pool in the basement. I mean, it can be real good stuff. But in the summer times, I'm here in the park, and I don't like to leave the park. I like to tell my stories in the park, and most of them are private gigs. And these private gigs are usually at the most austere homes throughout the park. Now, the park is big as the state of Massachusetts, so some of these places are pretty tough to get to. So it did happen that I had this really remarkable and interesting storytelling for me. About 4 months earlier, I had booked a gig that I had written in on my calendar that was what I thought an interesting acronym. We have lots of acronyms here in the park, and it was KNIT ADK wants me at 7 p.m. on a Saturday evening. And to meet Bruno at the dock. He would pick me up in the boat and take me to the austere cottage. Now, I had had gigs like this before where you had to meet somebody at a dock. There are many palatial cottages that are accessible only by boat here in the park, and it's wonderful to take those rides at night and think about what kind of crowds could be there. Lots of times it's famous people. It's just a cool situation. And I get to the dock, and there's Bruno, and Bruno looks every bit like a Bruno should look. He's a big fella. He looks like he could be the bouncer for 5 bars on the block at the same time. And he has this look about him that's like, get in the boat, don't say anything, and keep your hands inside the boat. Don't wiggle, don't woggle, nothing. We're going to our destination. He grunted twice. So I knew that he knew I was there. We touched off at the dock. He just reached out, grabbed the dock, and said, "They'll meet you at the door." And then he pushed the boat back out, and he was gone. So I walked up the pathway, and honestly, the pathway to some of these houses, flagstone that they brought in from all over the world, and there's plantings and gobs of ferns, and everything is blooming, and it smells gorgeous, and there's bark on logs, and there's all kinds of knit together twig work over the awnings of the porch, and you're just excited to see what's inside. And so I go to the door, and there is somebody to meet me, and she's a rather fetching young lady in a towel. Now, in my storytelling, I wear the garb of a man who had just stepped out of the woods as a guide or a logger in the 1880s, and I've got my Adirondack plaid pants on, wool, and I've got my nice heavy wool shirt, and my bowler beaver felt hat, and the sweat just starts to cling in places. And she opens the door and she says, "Well, we're all in here." And I said, "Am I in the right place? I'm a storyteller for the Knit ADK." Now, in my mind, I'm thinking it's a knitting group. I'm thinking, I've done mother-daughter banquets. I've done retreats for people with cancer. I've done, good days and sunshine for kids who are terminal. I've done all kinds of things, but I didn't quite get what the Knit ADK acronym really stood for until I stepped in. Nude in the Adirondacks. Now, the great room was a room perhaps 50 feet wide by about 70 feet deep. And it had Morris chairs with what looked like leather cushions. Could have been something else. I wasn't really concentrating on the coverings, because on top of this furniture everywhere was obviously a women's retreat for nudism, with me as their guest for the evening. Now, at that point, I wasn't thinking about whether I was going to be paid, wasn't thinking about whether I was going to be stranded there. I wasn't perhaps even thinking that there was going to be a good meal or a glass of wine provided, although a glass of wine would have been real handy. I thought perhaps, how many stories do I know? I could be here a while, I think. And so I started my presentation by introducing myself and asking if it was okay if I stayed dressed as I was. "Oh, yes, that's fine. That's great." Okay. And I took a deep breath and I thought to myself, how many stories do I know now? Because nothing was coming. Normally, I have lots of stories and they're immediate, and I have thousands of stories and hundreds of songs, and my mind is like this strange filing cabinet. And it's rather like when you sit in your car and you hear the first 3 bars of the music from the 1970s and you know the whole song and you start singing it before it even comes on. This is the way my mind works with stories, thousands of them in file folders, and the file folders have somehow been duct taped shut. And I'm just there among Rubens' nudes, thinking to myself, wow, being a storyteller is a pretty awesome profession.